The air in our shared bedroom always smelled of cedar chips and worn leather, a heavy, masculine scent that seemed to settle into the very fibers of the carpet. I remember lying awake on humid summer nights, staring at the ceiling, wishing for a scent that was lighter, something like lavender or rain, something that didn't feel so thick in my lungs. But the real weight wasn't the air. It was the sleeping figure in the bed across from mine, my twin brother. Looking at him was like looking at a photo negative of myself, a perfect, effortless copy of the person everyone thought I was, while I lay there, feeling like a ghost haunting my own life. I realized early on that his effortless existence made my own performance feel even more fractured, as if I were a shadow trying to detach itself from the object it was cast by. We were never just two children. We were the boys. That phrase hung over our childhood like a title we hadn't earned but were forced to defend. It was a plural identity that erased the edges of where he ended and I began. When relatives visited, they would clap us on the shoulders with the same heavy hands, gift us identical toy trucks, and marvel at the symmetry of our faces. "You can't tell them apart," they would say, laughing as if it were a magic trick. But I could tell. I felt the difference in the marrow of my bones. Standing next to him felt like a constant, quiet accusation. He was the solid ground, and I was the fault line running through it. I felt distinct, other, and unbraided from the reality everyone else saw so clearly. I remember the texture of Sunday mornings most vividly. That was when the performance required a costume. My mother would lay out our church clothes, stiff button-down shirts with collars that felt like cardboard against my neck, and rough, dark denim that scraped against my skin. For my brother, these clothes were just fabric. He would pull them on, button the cuffs, and run out into the yard, comfortable in his own skin and the cotton that covered it. For me, they were a constraint. I would stand in front of the mirror, buttoning the shirt all the way to the top, feeling a rising panic that had no name. The fabric felt abrasive, not just physically, but spiritually. It felt like I was being wrapped in wire. I would look at my brother, sitting on the edge of his bed, tying his shoes, and wonder why the same materials that made him look strong made me feel so incredibly small. There is a specific memory that stays with me, sharp as a piece of glass. We were 10 years old, and our parents had booked a professional photo session. The studio was hot, smelling of dust and developing fluid. The photographer, a man with a loud, booming voice, positioned us back to back, then side by side. "Chin up, boys," he commanded. "Look tough." My brother shifted his weight, squared his shoulders, and stared into the lens with a natural, easy confidence. He didn't have to think about it. He simply occupied the space. I tried to mimic him. I watched the angle of his chin, the set of his jaw, and I tried to arrange my face into the same shape. But inside, I felt like a forgery. When the proofs came back weeks later, the difference was unmistakable to me. He looked like the original. I looked like a flawed replica, a sketch drawn by a shaky hand. In his eyes, there was clarity. In mine, there was a kind of bewildered panic, a silent plea that had been captured in high definition. He wasn't a villain in this story. He was never cruel to me about it. In fact, that made it worse. He was simply a painful benchmark of correct masculinity, a standard I was failing to meet simply by existing. He was the control group, and I was the variable that had gone wrong. Whenever I tried to walk like him or deepen my voice to match his cadence, a kind of internal static would rise in my head. It was a gray noise, drowning out my own thoughts. It happened when I forced my stride to be longer, heavier. It happened when I sat with my legs apart, taking up space I didn't want. The static was the sound of my own intuition screaming that this was wrong, that the architecture of the boys was a structure built to house two people, but I was slowly suffocating inside the walls. I loved him, but I envied the silence in his head. I envied the way the world looked at him and saw exactly what he felt himself to be. While I stood next to him, identical in every way that didn't matter, and felt like I was vanishing. Then came the years where time didn't just pass, it thickened. Puberty wasn't a transition for me. It felt like a slow-motion collision I was powerless to stop. If childhood was a costume I could awkwardly wear, adolescence was when the costume began to fuse to my skin. It started subtly, a darkening of hair on the upper lip, a coarseness to the skin. But to me, every change felt like a siren blaring in a quiet room. I woke up morning after morning, rushing to the mirror not to admire myself, but to inspect the damage. I was looking for signs of the enemy, and the enemy was my own body. The cruelty of having a twin is that you have a preview of your own inevitable fate walking around in the room with you. I watched my brother broaden. I watched his shoulders expand, pushing against the seams of his shirts in a way that everyone called filling out, but to me looked like a hardening. He was becoming a man, and he was doing it with a kind of triumphant joy. He would flex in the mirror, grinning at the new definition in his arms. I would stand behind him, seeing the same potential in my own frame, and feel a wave of nausea so profound it made my knees weak. It was a specific kind of horror to watch the person who shared your DNA thrive on the very poison that was slowly killing your spirit. I was trapped on a conveyor belt, watching the machinery crush him into a shape he loved, knowing I was next. The sound was the worst part. I remember the summer his voice broke. It didn't just crack, it dropped, settling into a deep, resonant timbre that vibrated in his chest. He sounded like our father. He sounded like authority. When he spoke, the air seemed to make room for him. My own voice began to waver, dipping into ranges that felt foreign and heavy. I stopped speaking as much. I learned to hoard my words because every time I opened my mouth, the sound that came out felt like a stranger interrupting me. It felt like a foreign object lodged in my throat. I envied the way he could shout across a soccer field, his voice booming with certainty. My voice felt like a betrayal, a traitor broadcasting a lie to the world every time I answered a question. The gap between us, once just a hairline fracture of internal feeling, became a physical chasm. He found his kingdom in the locker rooms and on the muddy fields of high school sports. He thrived in the sweat and the shoving, the rough camaraderie of young men testing their strength. I tried to follow him there because that's what the boys did, but I felt like an alien observer in a study of human behavior. The smell of the locker room, stale sweat, body spray, damp towels, didn't smell like belonging to me. It smelled like danger. I stood in the corner, towel clutched tight around my waist, terrified that if I let my guard down, they would see that I was an imposter. I was stranded in a no man's land, unable to relate to the women I felt drawn to, and unable to relate to the men I looked like. It was during these years that the metaphor of the shadow took hold of me. For a long time, I felt like I was his shadow, attached to him, mimicking his movements, but lacking the substance and color that made him real. But as we grew older, it felt like the shadow was trying to detach itself. I was tearing away from the source, but the severance was messy. I would watch him laughing with his friends, moving through the world with such infuriating ease, and I would feel a hot, silent envy rise in my chest. It wasn't that I wanted to be him. I didn't want his gender. I didn't want his life. I wanted his peace. I wanted the luxury of a body that didn't feel like a cage. I wanted to know what it felt like to wake up and not have to declare war on your own reflection before breakfast. He had no internal static. He just was. And that simplicity seemed like the most impossible magic in the world. High school became less about education and more about an intense, desperate study of the person sitting across the breakfast table. I treated my brother like a living textbook on how to survive. I wasn't just looking at him, I was dissecting him. I watched the way he occupied a chair, legs sprawled out with an assumption of space that I had to consciously force myself to mimic. I studied where he put his hands when he was standing still, thumbs hooked casually into pockets, shoulders rolled back, chest open. I memorized the cadence of his nod when he passed friends in the hallway, that sharp, upward tilt of the chin that signaled recognition without needing a smile. And then, I would try to replicate it. But what was fluid for him was calcified for me. I spent 4 years holding my body in a state of constant, rigid tension, terrified that if I relaxed for even a second, my wrists would go limp or my walk would soften, and the truth would leak out. The physical exhaustion of that performance is hard to describe to someone who hasn't lived it. It wasn't the good kind of tired you feel after a long run or a day of hard work. It was a deep, nervous fatigue that settled into the base of my spine. I was constantly overriding my own nervous system. Every time I wanted to cross my legs at the knee, I had to mentally correct to the ankle. Every time my voice wanted to pitch up in excitement, I had to drag it back down into my chest. I was holding my body in a shape that didn't fit, like trying to force a soft, round thing into a square, iron mold. My muscles ached from the effort of simply standing correctly. I would come home at the end of the day, close the door to our room, and collapse onto the bed. Not because I was sleepy, but because the sheer effort of holding myself together had drained me dry. There is one night that stands out, a night that felt like the culmination of this entire charade. It was our junior prom. Our mother, thrilled by the milestone, had rented us matching tuxedos. Black wool, satin lapels, crisp white shirts with pleats that felt like ridges of bone against my chest. My brother stood in the living room, adjusting his cufflinks, laughing at something our dad said. He looked incredible. He looked like James Bond, comfortable, charming, entirely at home in the formality of the suit. The tuxedo didn't wear him, he wore it. It moved with him like a second skin. I stood next to him, and I felt like I was encased in lead. The fabric scratched at my wrists. The collar felt like a chokehold. When we got to the dance, the contrast became unbearable. The gymnasium was hot, smelling of cheap cologne, floor wax, and desperation. I watched my brother on the dance floor, spinning his date, his head thrown back in laughter, the tuxedo moving fluidly with his body. He was magnetic. I stood by the punch bowl, terrified to move, terrified to breathe too deeply. My date, a kind girl who deserved so much better, kept asking if I was okay. I told her I was just tired. But I wasn't tired. I was panicked. I looked at her, and I looked at my brother, and I realized I was deceiving them both. She thought she was with a shy, quiet version of him. She didn't know she was with a girl who was currently suffocating inside a rental suit, feeling like a spy in enemy territory. Except the enemy territory was her own life. That feeling of being an imposter is a common human experience, I know. But it lands differently when the person you are impersonating is sleeping 3 feet away from you. Every time I looked at him, I saw the standard I was failing to meet, and it heightened the guilt to a fever pitch. Twinship is supposed to be the ultimate transparency. We shared a womb. We shared a room. We had a language of half-sentences and glances that no one else could decode. We were conspirators in everything, sneaking out at night, covering for each other's lies, sharing the same colds and the same jokes. But this was a wall. I was hiding the biggest, most fundamental part of myself from the one person who was supposed to know me better than anyone. It felt like a violation of the twin contract. I would look at him sleeping, his face relaxed and unguarded, and feel a crushing weight of secrecy. I was lying to the world, sure, but lying to him felt like a betrayal of our blood. Masculinity became an armor I had to strap on every morning. And it wasn't the heroic kind of armor you see in movies, shining and protective. It was heavy, dark, and suffocating. It pinched my skin. It limited my range of motion. It made it impossible to feel the air or the sun. I walked through those years encased in it, peering out through the narrow slit of the visor, watching my brother live freely while I dragged this iron weight around, pretending it was just my skin. I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that I couldn't carry it forever. The straps were digging in, and sooner or later, the weight would bring me to my knees. But there were cracks in the armor. There had to be, or I would have suffocated completely. My survival depended on the stolen hours when the house was empty, when my parents were at work and my brother was at soccer practice. Those rare, golden pockets of time when the performance could be suspended. I remember the specific quality of the silence in the house during those afternoons. It wasn't empty. It was pregnant with possibility. It was the only time the air didn't feel thick with expectation. I would wait until the sound of my brother's car faded down the street, counting to 60 just to be sure, before I allowed my shoulders to drop. The tension that I carried in my jaw, in my spine, in the very way I held my hands, would slowly unspool, leaving me feeling lightheaded and trembling. I had a hiding spot, of course. In a shared room, privacy is a myth, so I had to be creative. Deep in the back of the closet, behind the wall of stiff denim and plaid flannel that constituted my daily uniform, there was a loose floorboard. Beneath it lay a small, flattened canvas bag. It wasn't much, a collection of things I had scavenged or bought in terrified rushes at thrift stores 3 towns over. A silk scarf with a pattern of faded violets. A soft, oversized cashmere sweater that had lost its shape but kept its touch. A simple cotton sundress that I had never dared to wear out of the room. These weren't just objects. They were artifacts of a civilization I was exiled from. The moment my skin touched those fabrics, the world changed. I would strip off the heavy, rough clothes that felt like sandpaper against my spirit and slide into something soft. I remember the first time I pulled that silk scarf over my shoulders. It was cool to the touch, fluid like water, and as it settled against my neck, the internal static, that constant gray noise of trying to be a boy, suddenly went quiet. It was shocking how immediate the silence was. For hours, every day, my brain was screaming, calculating every move, every pitch of my voice, every angle of my stance. But the moment I wore something that aligned with the person inside, the screaming stopped. I could breathe. The air felt cleaner. The light in the room seemed to shift from a harsh fluorescent glare to something warm and amber. I would stand in front of the full-length mirror on the back of our bedroom door, the same mirror where I usually practiced my tough face, and I would finally see someone I recognized. It wasn't a costume. That's what people don't understand. The tuxedo at prom, the football jersey, the button-down shirts, those were the costumes. Standing there in a thrifted dress that was slightly too big, with the fabric brushing against my calves, I felt impossibly natural. I didn't have to pose. I didn't have to square my shoulders or harden my jaw. I could just stand there. I could let my hands fall where they wanted. I could tilt my head and see a softness in my eyes that the photographer had missed all those years ago. It was a feeling of profound homecoming, a realization that the body I was fighting wasn't the enemy. It was just being forced to fight a war it didn't believe in. But the sanctuary was fragile. It was built on glass. Even in the midst of that euphoric relief, there was always a sharp, metallic undercurrent of terror. I was constantly listening. Every creak of the house settling sounded like a footstep. The hum of a passing car sounded like my brother's engine. The fear wasn't just about being caught. It was about being caught by him. If my parents found me, it would be a catastrophe, certainly. But if my brother walked in? If the person who shared my face, who had been my other half since before we were born, opened that door and saw me like this? It felt like it would shatter the universe. I imagined the look on his face, not anger, but confusion. The betrayal of it. We were a set. We were the boys. By revealing this, I wouldn't just be changing my own identity, I would be rewriting his history too. I would be taking the narrative of our childhood and setting a match to it. I felt like a conspirator hiding a weapon, except the weapon was just my own soul. I would stand there, luminous and terrified, staring at the door handle, knowing that at any second, the person I loved most could turn it, and the perfect, symmetrical world we lived in would collapse into dust. It wasn't that I wanted to be someone else. I just wanted, so desperately, to stop pretending I was him. I wanted to be the person waiting behind the mask, even if I was the only one who ever saw her. When we finally left for college, putting 300 miles of highway between us, I thought the distance would save me. I convinced myself that without his physical presence constantly reminding me of the mold I was supposed to fit, I could finally breathe. I thought that if I wasn't waking up across the room from the standard of masculinity I failed to meet, the pressure would lift. But the opposite happened. Without him there to mimic, I lost my map. I was drifting in open water without a compass. The mask I had worn for 18 years didn't just feel heavy anymore. It felt like it was fused to my face, slowly suffocating me. The anxiety wasn't a spike of panic now and then. It was a constant, low-frequency hum, a gray noise that filled every room I walked into. It was the sound of a life being lived in the wrong key, a dissonance that vibrated in my teeth. I remember the specific Tuesday it all collapsed. It wasn't a dramatic event. There were no explosions, no public scenes. I was standing in the aisle of a grocery store at 11 at night, staring at a wall of cereal boxes. The fluorescent lights overhead were buzzing, that high-pitched electric whine that usually fades into the background, but that night, it sounded like a scream. I looked at the colorful boxes, the endless choices, the mundane normalcy of it all, and I suddenly couldn't remember how to be a person. I couldn't remember how to move my hands or how to stand without feeling like a fraud. The gray noise in my head dialed up until it was the only thing I could hear, drowning out the bad pop music playing over the speakers. My basket dropped from my hand. It hit the linoleum with a clatter that seemed to echo for miles, but I couldn't bend down to pick it up. I just stood there, paralyzed by the sheer, crushing weight of pretending. I left the basket right there on the floor. I walked out to my car, sat in the driver's seat, and didn't turn the engine on. I just sat in the dark, watching the condensation fog up the windows, blurring the shoppers walking past under the streetlights. They looked so solid, so real. And then I thought of my brother. I had seen a photo of him on social media earlier that day, just a candid shot of him laughing at a party, a red Solo cup in his hand, his arm draped strictly around a friend. He looked radiant. Not because he was handsome, though he was, but because he was there. He was fully inhabiting his moment. He wasn't calculating his posture. He wasn't translating his thoughts before speaking. He was just living. The envy that hit me then wasn't the hot, sharp jealousy of childhood. It was a cold, hollow despair. I realized that what I was doing wasn't living. It was coping. I was managing a chronic condition. I was surviving a war of attrition against my own spirit, and I was losing. The energy it took to maintain the facade of the good twin, the normal brother, was finite, and I had spent the last of it in that grocery aisle. I looked at my hands on the steering wheel, knuckles white, trembling, and I knew. I couldn't do it for one more day. The path I was on didn't lead to a future. It led to a vanishing point where I simply ceased to exist. The decision to stop running didn't feel like bravery. People talk about courage in these moments, but it didn't feel like courage. It felt like exhaustion. It was the desperate, gasping need for silence in my head. I needed the war to end. But with that resolve came the terror. I knew I couldn't just change. I had to dismantle the architecture of the boys that we had built our entire lives upon. And I knew, with a terrifying clarity, who I had to tell first. I couldn't tell my parents, or a therapist, or a friend. I had to tell him. I had to look the other half of myself in the eye and tell him that the mirror was broken. It felt like walking toward a cliff edge, knowing the only way to survive was to jump, praying that the fall wouldn't kill us both. I drove to his apartment on a rainy Thursday, the kind of gray, relentless afternoon that makes the world feel small. The drive felt like moving underwater. The windshield wipers slapped against the glass, counting down the seconds until my life potentially exploded. His place smelled like him. Old Spice, dark roast coffee, and that specific clean laundry detergent Mom had used for 20 years. It was a scent of continuity, of history. Walking into it felt like stepping into a museum dedicated to a timeline I was about to set on fire. Sitting on the edge of his worn leather couch, I felt like an intruder. My hands were shaking so violently, I had to tuck them under my thighs, pressing them into the denim just to keep them still. My throat felt like it had been packed with sawdust. Every swallow was a jagged effort. The air in the room seemed thin, insufficient to keep both of us alive, as if the oxygen was being sucked out by the sheer gravity of the secret sitting in my chest. He was talking about work, standing by the kitchenette, complaining about a project manager who wouldn't listen. His voice sounded tinny and far away, like it was coming through a radio with bad reception. Then he stopped. He stopped mid-sentence, the silence slicing through the room like a blade. He turned around slowly. He looked at me. He didn't just glance, he really looked, with that unnerving X-ray familiarity that only a twin possesses. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, pressing against my eardrums, demanding to be filled. "You're not okay," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with a quiet, terrifying certainty. I tried to summon the speech I had rehearsed in the car. I had planned a noble, articulate explanation of gender dysphoria, authenticity, and the psychological toll of repression. But the words disintegrated in my mouth. The script I had written vanished. All that came out was a jagged, broken whisper, stripped of all dignity. "I can't do it anymore." He didn't ask what it was. He didn't ask if I meant the job, or the city, or the master's program. He walked over and sat on the coffee table directly in front of me, forcing me to look at him. I waited for the confusion. I waited for him to tell me to toughen up. I waited for the rejection that would sever the cord between us and leave me drifting in space. "I know," he said softly. The world stopped spinning on its axis. "You know?" I choked out, the panic spiking. "How could you know? I haven't told anyone. I haven't said a word." He looked down at his hands, then back at me. "I didn't know what it was. I didn't know the name of it. But I knew you were gone. You've been gone for years." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a hush. "It's like standing next to a radio that's tuned between stations. I could feel the static coming off you. Every time we're together, you're vibrating with it. You look like you're in pain just standing still. I thought you hated me. Or you hated being around me." "No!" I gasped, the tears finally spilling over, hot and fast. "No, I never hated you. I hated that I wasn't you. I'm not a brother," I managed to say, the words feeling huge and dangerous, absolute and irreversible. I never was. He didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. He looked at me with a sadness that broke my heart, not because of who I was, but because of how long I had suffered alone in the dark. "Okay," he said. Just that. Okay. The terror that had been freezing my blood for a decade began to thaw. It was a physical sensation, painful and sweet at the same time. The room, which had felt cold and gray like a prison cell, suddenly seemed to warm up. The lamp in the corner cast a glow that felt like amber, soft and forgiving. The air rushed back into my lungs. I looked at him, my twin, my mirror, my benchmark, and for the first time, I didn't see a standard I had failed. I saw a brother who was waiting for me to finally show up. The static in my head, that relentless gray noise that had screamed for years, dropped to a hum, and then, miraculously, to silence. The days after that confession weren't a sudden explosion of glitter and rainbows. It was quieter than that. It was the feeling of taking off a pair of shoes that had been 2 sizes too small for 20 years. The relief was physical. I could sit on his couch and tuck my legs under me without calculating the angle. I could let my voice soften without the mental police blowing a whistle. The energy I had spent on the performance, that massive, invisible hydroelectric dam holding back the water, was suddenly free to be used for living. My brother became my translator in those early months. He didn't make speeches, but he shifted his stance. When we were out in public, before I had fully transitioned, he stood differently. He used to stand shoulder to shoulder, a solid wall of the boys. Now he created space. He became a buffer. If someone stared too long at the nail polish I had finally dared to wear, or the way my hair was growing out past my ears, he would catch their eye with a look that was polite but final. It was a silent boundary line. He wasn't protecting his little brother anymore. He was guarding his sister's right to exist. I remember one dinner where an old family friend asked, "How are the boys?" My brother didn't miss a beat. He smiled, gestured to me, and said, "We're great. She's actually applying to grad school." It was small, barely a ripple, but it rearranged the entire room. He had redrawn the map for them, so I didn't have to. There is a photo of us from last summer that sits on my desk now. We're at a family barbecue, the air smelling of charcoal and cut grass. He is wearing a polo shirt, holding a beer, looking exactly like the man he was always meant to be, solid, grounded, comfortable. I am standing next to him, wearing a sundress the color of sage, my hair caught in the wind. Visually, the symmetry is gone. We no longer look like a magic trick. We look like 2 different species of tree grown in the same soil. But emotionally, the distance in the photo is 0. We are leaning into each other, heads tilting toward the center. I look at that picture and I don't see the better version of me anymore. I just see him. I see his kindness, his stubbornness, his terrible taste in music. He isn't a benchmark I failed to reach. He is just my brother. The envy has evaporated, replaced by a profound appreciation for the differences between us. I realized that my femininity wasn't a rejection of him. It wasn't about leaving the boys because I didn't love him enough. It was the only way I could actually stand beside him as a whole person. A shadow cannot love the object it mimics. it can only haunt it. Only a separate, solid person can offer real love. Life now feels fluid. That is the only word for it. The rigid, iron architecture has melted. I remember standing in the kitchen with him recently, both of us cooking. He was chopping vegetables with that aggressive, rhythmic chop he does, and I was stirring a sauce, moving with a rhythm that was entirely my own. We weren't mirroring each other, we were harmonizing. That's the difference. Before, I was trying to sing his note and failing. Now, I'm singing my own, and it makes the chord complete. The war is over. The treaty has been signed, and the terms are simple. I get to be me, and he gets to be him. And neither of us has to be alone. Yesterday, I caught my reflection in the darkened window of a train car. For a split second, the old habit kicked in, the brace for impact, the expectation of seeing a stranger's face. But the woman staring back wasn't a stranger. She was soft, she was luminous, and she was entirely unbraided from the ghost she used to be. The split is finally healed. If you want to see what happens next, subscribe and join the story.